Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. I have the great pleasure today of being here with Jesus Carrillo. Jesus is an expert in the political economy of energy. He's a mechanical engineer and he's currently doing his Ph.D. at the Colegio de México. Well, actually, currently he's at Yale University in the US. Jesus, welcome to the program.
Hi, Alice. Thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be here.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you here because we want to talk today about the relationship between energy and inequality. Energy politics, rather said, we want to pursue the thought of what energy politics has to do with inequality and place it next to other important political fields like social policy, economic policy, industrial policy. So we could also consider energy policy, and that's important because we all know we have an environmental situation that requires certain attention to these topics. Jesus, let us start with something that you've been thinking a lot about, which is the question of the so-called resource curse. Could you explain us what the resource curse is and why it's a curse?
Yes, of course. The first thing that we need to acknowledge with this concept is that it's very old. It dates back to 1950 at least. And so a lot of social scientists and researchers in general have asked themselves the question of if resources in general, natural resources, undermine the development of given society or a state in general. And well, to this day, we still don't know exactly how to explain these situations with natural resources. First, because there's been a lot of changes in both institutional frameworks, economic frameworks, and political developments. So it is really difficult to do the research to do one specific research that can give us a really overarching explanation for this. And I think that there are four economic prominent explanations for this trait of some societies, and there are three political explanations for it as well. So let me go first through the four economic explanations. First, one that was really prominent during the 1960s and also until the first half of the 1970s was the resource curse was because it produced a decline in the terms of trade. So the terms of trade, for those who don't know this concept, are simply a ratio of the price of exports, of the level price of exports, to the price of imports. So it will say that how much we can import from that money that we get from our exports. So a decline in these terms of trade will mean that the value of the exports is being lost to the imports. So then many economists acknowledge Raúl Prebisch as one of the really important scholars that developed this theory. So then if we are exporting quite a few or many natural resources, but we are not getting enough of imports with that money, then we are losing the opportunity to develop our societies. So that's one explanation. Another one, which is really important as well, and actually I think this is a really important explanation for these days and for contexts like the Mexican one, is the instability of the international markets in commodities. So we have seen just last year how the oil price and many other commodities was shocked by the COVID lockdowns and all the downturn of the aggregate demand in the whole world.
And went negative for the first time, right?
Yeah, it went negative for one day in April 24th, I think. So yeah, so this instability makes difficult for societies to plan ahead, and also makes difficult for governments that rely on this resource to be able to have a stable income over time and then pursue the social policies that they have or that they want to put in place. One third explanation is one that has really faded out from the literature, from the academic literature in this field, is the poor linkages between resource and non-resource sectors. This means, and this was studied because from 1950 to, or even before that, but all up on to 1975, most of the rich oil countries hadn't yet expropriated the oil sectors. So many foreign companies were in those countries and they were seizing basically most of the profits of these resources, and they weren't making a global or a general effect on these economies. So then the resource industries were simply being extracted, or the profits of these industries were extracted to foreign countries. But this stopped happening, especially in the oil sector after 1975, when most of the rich oil countries already had expropriated the oil sectors. And the last one, from an economic standpoint, is the so-called Dutch disease. And this one is related to how one sector is pulling or is drawing away a lot of capital and a lot of labor from other sectors. Because one thing is that we have, let's talk, for example, about Campeche or Tabasco in Mexico, and there's a lot of oil activity going on there. And since it needs many people and needs many other services, so it starts drawing capital and labor to this specific sector. Also, because the money that is incoming to the country because of the exports of these natural resources is also increasing the real rate of exchange. So this makes other sectors harder to compete with foreign industries. So as you can see, these explanations are different even in the way that they think about the resources. The first three ones, at least, consider that there's not enough money in the economy coming from these resources to foster the development in general. And the last one, the Dutch disease, is the contrary. It's too much money, and then it's hurting the economy because it's simply not letting it diversify itself. So these are the four economic explanations, the main explanation that economists have been given through time. And then we have political explanations as well. So there are three main political explanations for this resource course. And the first one is cognitive. This means that politicians or people who holds power in general, they are short-sighted. So they don't see much into the future, but they only want to achieve specific goals for their term, for example, or for their own interest if they're not into government. Just to give an example. So this is the first one, and this is widely acknowledged as one of these theories. It's really difficult to test it empirically, but it's something that we all have heard of. I think we all have heard of this short-sightedness or these myopic views that politicians have usually. Another one is a more societal explanation, and this is taking a view on how classes or interest groups or sectors have contrasting views on or have contrasted interests in how we hold or how we distribute the wealth that is related to one particular resource. It could be oil, for example. So you have in some countries like Mexico, for example, we have a really powerful union that is in Pemex, and they actually have an enormous amount of power, and they have had it through time.
Pemex is the national oil company.
Yes.
Just to mention.
Yes, thank you. So this national oil company has been powerful a long time, and actually since President Cardenas and all the way through José López Portillo in Mexico in the 1970s. So this will be the first 40 years from the expropriation of the oil. A lot of oil has been used in a way to balance the power between the groups that served the interest of the main political party or the only political which had power in Mexico for that time. So this is one of the ways that we can think about these resources. So they are needed to hold in place the class structure or the interest group structures in the society. So this is really interesting as well, and it can be as well tested, of course. And another one, and I think this is I mean, at least I consider it the fun one. Of course, this could be not fun at all for many people, but this is a more state-centered explanation. And so we think about this in how these resources and how the state relates to them weaken the state institutions. Now, this concept of rentier state it was first brought up by Hussein Mahdavi in 1970, so it's really old. But I think that this is the one that has caught the more attention through time, and specifically in the last 20 years, because we have seen that when we test all the hypotheses in statistical terms, or even in qualitative studies, we have seen that it's really hard to test all of them. All these explanations are really hard to test, and they all fall short. But one thing that we know, and one specific trait that these countries that are rich in resources is that they usually are laxic in taxing the population, and taxing specifically the private activities in general economic terms. So they are usually tax weak, or so this leads us to many other conclusions. And actually, the rentier state didn't exactly begin with this kind of explanation. It was more to the side of how big a sector is. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the oil sector has accounted for more than 90% of GDP in some years. So it's really, really big sector in one economy. So another ones are, and actually Mexico was in this group of countries with really high level of exports to GDP ratio coming from a natural resource. So this is another way to putting this specific term of rentier state. So I think that since we are thinking about a lot of movements and a lot of policies, a lot of trends that the state has taken with the use of natural resources, I mainly study energy and oil in specific. So also we have some state-owned enterprise. As you were saying before, Mexico has this large company which is called Pemex, and it has existed for a long time now. And it is basically the producer of 99.9% of oil in Mexico. And many of these state-owned enterprises have been used to, first, as I was saying, to hold in place some political traits of a society or economic traits of a society, as well as they have a really strong link to the government, and they make a state inflexible in terms of taxation and in terms of expenditure. So there are many things that we can discuss about the rentier states and how we can explain these resource curves from a state standpoint. But I think these are the most important explanations, these 7 explanations. As you can see, there is many work to do in all of them. But I think that the most prominent one, at least in the political economy kind of research that we have these days, is more into the state. And sometimes the Dutch disease keeps having some attention in the economic field.
Let's maybe concretize this rather abstract explanation with the case of Mexico. You are an expert in Pemex studies, studies of the gas sector or oil sector in Mexico. And I mean, in terms of your explanations, it's very attention calling that precisely Pemex needs lots of resources from the state. And also until recently, the state was relying on Pemex for over 30% of state revenue. And as you mentioned already, the Mexican state is quite weak in terms of tax collection beyond Pemex. Could you say something more about what you mentioned, this inflexibility that surges from this kind of being tied to one specific company and the challenges that come with that, and especially in connection with the global movements of prices? And I mean, even, considering the fact that Mexico has the oil and gets it out of the soil or the ground and then needs to export it to get it processed and then re-import it and the costs associated to that. So it's like a whole complicated sector. It's much more than just getting the oil out and then being done.
Definitely. Yeah, so let's start by going a little bit just back to 1950, 60, and up to 1970. So the first way of relating to oil was to use it in a domestic way, and it was to foster the internal markets. And it was this time of trying to be self-sufficient in energy and in many other things. but specifically in energy terms. So then, after 1970, and specifically after the failure to do a really integral, a really deep fiscal reform in 1972, the national government in Mexico started relying more and more on oil. Then we had this, I should call it just jackpot, then when we discovered Akal, which is the second largest field that has ever been producing oil. It's only behind Gawar, which is in Saudi Arabia. So Akal became a really big source of income. Okay, so what's going on here? Before the 1975-76 jackpot and the start of production on Akal, so we had more stability and different situation, a different environment in Mexico. And so the oil income, the revenue that government raises from oil, it was usually used in a discretionary manner. And this is the most important thing, how the government can rely discretionarily on this oil. Then after 1976, when some things started not to be so good, and then the debt crisis exploded in 1980, and then we had some other problems. So we didn't have that much discretionary use of oil, especially it really fell from 1987 to 2003. This is also correlated with the oil price, because in the 1970s we had really high oil prices, and then in the 80s it started falling, and it was not really high until the what we call the third oil price boom, which started in 2003. And then, so in 2003 and all the way to 2008, the government, the Mexican government, all again had a lot of discretionary use of these excedents. Why does this happen? Well, that's one of the political explanations. That when the government has some income or some revenue that is not coming from taxes, maybe society doesn't keep an eye on what's going on with that money, because it's not coming directly from our activities. So that's one of the explanation that is usually given. In any case, this discretionary use of resources can serve to different interests. Of course, in Vicente Fox's term, which was from 2000 to 2006, the objectives of the federal government were not the same. Of course, they were the same because now we had more variety, or the power was more distributed between the political parties. So this helped, or this had to be acknowledged by the federal government, and they decided to, just going to use the word bribe, the governors, the state governors, to fall in line with certain policies. And also this excessive income that we had from oil was used to, mostly in whole history, to put in place many clientelist policies that may not serve well the long-term trend of development and also the reduction in inequality, but it just helps to, again, hold the class structure as it is. So this has been a really big movement. Now, how do they do that? Well, they simply underestimate resources, and they underestimate the price that is going to be in place the next year. And then when you observe a higher price of oil, then you have excellence. It's not that they are excellence by any standard. They're just excellent from the budget. So that's quite important to say. So discretionary use and this excellent and this high reliance of the budget, at least in Mexico, has impeded the construction of a merit-based bureaucracy. So this reliance on oil by the federal government has just been one big pot where clientelist policies go to, or the political party has power. They kind of use the bureaucracy structure to have their own allies in place. So we don't have an efficient government in that sense, and this could be related to oil, through other channels. Of course, it's not just oil for its sake. Another thing that we have, and this is really important, and I think this is really old, at least in Mexico, is the centralization of the public finances. Since taxes are not the main, or they're not as important as they are in other countries in terms of government revenue, so these excedents that come from oil are used by the central government, are used by the federal government, and they are a source of power specifically. And as they go up, the power that is related to it goes up as well. So this is really important. And then we have another trait. We have a micromanagement of the national budget. So instead of having the states and the municipalities using their own income or using the resources that come after the distribution of taxes at a national level, it is the federal government who decides what kind of infrastructure is built, what kind of social programs are in place, and in general, how the political movements of government income are used. And I think this has been the most important fact, to say that we are relying too much on oil, and also that oils at the end simply is used to hold inequality, which is really high in Mexico. And even when we look at the regressiveness of the subsidies in Mexico, because they are regressive, they are in relative terms progressive. But this is only because it's regressive. The regressiveness of subsidies is just less regressive than the income distribution. So since we are a really highly unequal society in terms of income, then even this regressiveness seems progressive. To put it in a simpler way, we are so unequal as a country that even the regressive use of oil income is not as regressive.
I would like to come back to something that you just said about the long-term trend there, and that relates to what you just said in the end, the inequality aspect of it. Oil doesn't strike one as something particularly sustainable in the mid or far away future. What is the environmental aspect that has to be considered here, and how is that related to these inequalities that you were just describing?
So I would say that let's look at what the big oil companies are doing, because I think they know exactly where the market is going, and that's why they are behaving the way they are. And last year, Total, BP, and others announced that by 2040 or 2050, they will be carbon-free companies. That was striking. I mean, those were some news. Because if they are moving away from oil, it's something that is coming. So I really think that we should be aware of that, just because they are showing the trend where we are moving is to a more sustainable way of producing energy, which has to be away from oil. If we want to accomplish some reduction or a less hurtful impact from climate change, we really need to stop relying so much on oil. And we still don't have a, let's say, enough reliable source of energy that we are going into, because either wind or solar or others cannot replace oil easily. Maybe the one that can actually replace it is nuclear energy, but then we will have problems with water, which is intensively used in nuclear energy production. So regardless of what we do, it is clear that we are trying to move as humanity, and the capitalist societies as well are moving away from oil. It's not just that we are trying to move because it's super nice to the environment, or is super nice to the trees, or to whatever, or to other people, or to poor people to move away, but also the core of the capitalist societies is moving away from oil. So that's really important. If it was only a societal movement, if it was only a really popular movement that is claiming for a change, I wouldn't be as convinced that the world is moving away from oil. But since the core of this system is moving away from oil, I really think that we need to consider moving away as well.
The dinosaurs are modernizing.
Exactly, the dinosaurs are.
Yeah, well, interesting thought, and maybe a hopeful perspective. Before we come to a close, Jesus, I was wondering if you could say something about why you got interested in the subject in the first place. What caught your attention to study exactly these issues?
As you said at the beginning of our conversation, I'm a mechanical engineer, and as a mechanical engineer, the heat transfer part of my profession was really interesting. So this led me to think about energy in general. So energy in general, I think, is really important because, it's used basically to speak or to whatever. To every movement that we make requires energy. So that's simply important. That's simply interesting from an intellectual standpoint. But then, as I grew more interested in general social issues, especially development issues, and then I studied my master's degree in economics. So I had this professor who told me that you really have an interesting profile to go deeper into energy from an economic standpoint, and I bought it, and I think it's super nice. I think it's super nice because sometimes it's really interesting to actually know what's going on with the atoms, with how the pressure makes oil flow from the ground, how it's converted and how it's used. And so these technical parts are really interesting and really fulfilling for me in that sense. But also the political part of it, the economical part of it is really interesting for me as well, because it's really entrenched with how the society is evolving. And I really think that if we don't look at energy as a key sector for development and to reduce inequality, we are really missing on the trends and on the movements that might make our societies better. I sometimes believe that these fields are so specific that it's really hard to think of energy as a system, but we need to. We need to think about energy as a system, and I really think that people with a profile such as mine are able to contribute in a little way, but hopefully in a significant way to these kind of studies. So that's why I think it's just I bought someone's comments, and here I am.
We're very happy that you bought the comment, and we're very happy to have had you here on this episode, Jesus. Thank you so much for telling us about the dinosaurs and the energy and the inequalities and how they relate, and the appeal to a better, cleaner future, and also more sustainable and hopefully more just and more equitable future. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for this conversation, Alice. It's been really nice.
Thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. And if you're interested in these subjects and would like to learn more, you can join us again for another episode. I'm Alice Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams, Future Frame TV. You can subscribe to our channel, you can like and share and comment on our posts, and we hope that we'll see you again